66 million years ago, after the violent demise of the non-avian dinosaurs, courtesy of a mountain-sized asteroid, the world was left up for grabs. And one little group among the rubble wasted no time in making it their own. And that would be, of course, us, or rather, mammals. Relatively quickly, mammals that survived quickly filled in the gaps that dinosaurs once, filled, leading to a massive explosion in mammalian diversity and size, growing far, far larger than previously, no longer being held back by their old tyrant overlords. And this trend of getting bigger and bigger ended up continuing for quite some time, as for millions of years, the bar kept getting a little bit higher and higher, until on land at least, it reached its final form, about 34 million years ago during the Eocene epoch, when a new titanic mammal popped up across the plains of Eurasia, a strange animal that can only be best described as a giant hornless rhino, and its name is Paraceratherium. It was touted by many scientists as being the largest land mammal to have ever lived, and by a fair margin at that, with nothing having come close to it previously or since its discovery. And yet, this might not actually be the truth, as in the 1800s, a chance discovery was made in India that unveiled a new prehistoric elephant so giant that it not only shook our understanding of mammals and our max size, but has challenged even the Paraceratherium in stature, with it now often being dubbed the true king of mammals, and the largest mammal to have ever walked. And this is Paleoloxodon pneumaticus. As you might have picked up on by its name, this new mysterious elephant wasn't a genus, like Homo, rather being a specific species that belonged to an already known genus, the Paleoloxodon. Now, this rather extensive genus of elephants was first thought to have evolved out of Africa some 4 million years ago during the early Pliocene, and emphasis on first thought, as now we aren't actually sure how old they truly are, with currently the oldest universally agreed upon Paleoloxodon only being about 1.8 million years old, having appeared in the early Pleistocene, and that is Paleoloxodon recki. This species was similar to the later Pneumaticus in the sense that it was an absolute giant, with a completed male specimen from Kenya indicating a shoulder height similar to the total height of a female giraffe, and an overall weight slightly greater than 12 tons, which already makes it larger than any living species of elephant today. And guess what? In 2024, it got another size increase as well, with a review of 7 measured specimens showing a size range from 4.5 tons all the way up to 15.3 tons, which is, for perspective, heavier than 6 of the largest living rhinos smushed together. And with their large size, powerful tusks, and other indispensable tools, this new genus ended up taking over Africa and becoming the most dominant and widespread elephant within the continent. And from there, things would only get crazier for the Paleoloxodon, as approximately 800,000 years ago, a certain population of recki migrated out of Africa, likely being spurred on by aridification and habitat shifts, and thus they made their way into Eurasia, where this migratory group would eventually become not 1, but 2 new species. One of them was the Enticus, an equally massive elephant that tipped the scales at over 15 tons, and on top of that was taller than nearly every theropod to have ever lived. Ironically though, despite their initial size, many of these elephants would one day spread to various islands throughout Europe, such as Crete and Cyprus, where then its descendants would actually shrink due to insular dwarfism, and one day resulting in the smallest elephants to ever exist, some of which, by the way, were smaller than pigs. So, truly a far cry from the enormity of the Enticus. And yet, even this elephant, the Enticus, was nothing to that second species which descended from the recki. And as you might be able to guess, that species was Paleoloxodon pneumaticus. Back in the 1830s, bones belonging to this animal were first located by the British East India Company within the central region of the country. Now, the first finds mainly consisted of a skull and parts of postcranial material near the Godavari River. And it was clear that this was a new species of elephant, but no one could agree on if it belonged to the same genus as the still living African elephants, or if it was a kind of ancient elephantid. And it wasn't until 1942 that the new creature was definitively added as a species to the Paleoloxodon genus, instead of the genus Loxodonta, which the African elephants belonged to. However, with this said, while it did take quite a while for its classification to be fully confirmed, it did not take long for paleontologists to realize that this was one whopper of an animal, as just one located femur early on was larger than that of a freaking Triceratops, who, as you may know, is another giant in its own right, to put it lightly. And based off of this found femur, it was estimated that it belonged to a 4.35 meter or 14.3 foot tall individual that was heavier than any African elephant ever recorded. So, mighty impressive. However, the real shocker would only come after this discovery, as eventually a even more ridiculously sized femur was found, which was stated as being about 20% larger than the previous, and one of the first signs that the Pneumaticus was really in a weight class of its own. And in 2015, one study estimated that this new specimen in life might have stood as tall as 5.2 meters or 17.1 feet at the shoulders, making it not only taller than most giraffes, but also taller than every single terrestrial carnivorous predator ever, including the Spinosaurus if you don't count the sail. And given its estimated volume, researchers believe that this individual could have weighed as heavy as 22 tons, which at this size officially outclassed the Paraceratherium, and thus giving it the title of the largest land mammal known to science thus far. On top of this already crazy achievement, this absurd weight would make it considerably heavier than the Spinosaurus, Giganotosaurus, and T-Rex. And plus, by the way, every non-sauropod dinosaur to ever live. In fact, forget non-sauropods, it was even able to rival numerous sauropods at this size, including some of the most famous longnecks out there, such as the Diplodocus and the Brontosaurus. So we're talking about such a size that it's almost kind of hard to picture it, and a size that really reignited the conversation on just how big terrestrial mammals could get. Although there was a bit of a problem, and that was that these remains were ultimately fragmented, and it made many paleontologists quite skeptical of the size estimates, including, by the way, the author of the study himself, who said that 22 tons should be taken with a grain of salt. But that being said, the issue of fragmentation is not something unique to the Pneumaticus either, as it's also been a problem for the Paraceratherium and other contenders for the title of top dog, or top mammal, leading to much debate and argument on this topic. However, all is not lost for the Pneumaticus's claim, as in early 2023, a new study took a look at yet another specimen, simply referred to as CF Paleoloxodon pneumaticus. And in this study, the species was found to be relatively close in size to the previous estimates, with them giving it a weight of up to 19 tons. And what's also very interesting is that the very same study also did a separate analysis on the Paraceratherium, which concluded that it was actually lighter than the elephant, despite being taller, with a weight of around 17 tons, and thus leading to increased agreement that the Pneumaticus truly is the current largest land mammal known to science, at least on average. And then, on top of that, just 2 years ago, there was a third study that analyzed 5 different specimens that also reported a max weight of around 19 tons, possibly even a bit more, which shows at the very least, the Pneumaticus is still definitely an absolute giant in mammalian terms. And not to take shots or anything, but a 2022 paper separately reported that an analysis of 2 species of Paraceratherium found a size range between 11 and 12.4 tons. So not beating our boy there. Additionally, even if the Paleoloxodon pneumaticus tapped out at 19 tons instead of 22 tons, it would still retain the achievement of being larger than any known theropod. And just to give you a little taste for how big 19 tons still is, that's about 300 times heavier than your average human and 3 times bigger than the average African bush elephant, the largest living land animal of today. Also, one must not forget that these estimates are based on what has been found, which is to say, very little, considering how many of them must have lived through the ages. So, if we are finding multiple specimens already that are possibly 19 tons and maybe 22 tons, then maybe 22 tons or more isn't so crazy, especially when you consider that extant elephants, their closest living relatives obviously, show considerable size variation across the board. For example, the largest male Asian elephants are about 40% heavier than what's considered the average max weight, while the largest recorded African bush elephant thus far hovered around 11 tons, which is, for perspective, nearly double the size of a typical individual, so who knows just how big the Pneumaticus could have gotten. Unfortunately though, exceptionally sized individuals like these record breakers are usually 1 in thousands or even millions. So while my imagination does wonder, I personally am not getting my hopes too high for a monstrous specimen popping up anytime soon. Although this said, with our current specimen, it is honestly kind of greedy of me to complain for more, as their stature was truly shocking. And ultimately, the Pneumaticus wasn't just big-bodied, but it was also extremely dense and sturdy, with its skull in particular being exceptionally well built. And over the years, it's drawn a lot of attention, not just for being dense, but also because of its unique shape. As like other Paleoloxodon species, the Pneumaticus had large growths of bone known as a parieto-occipital crest on top of its skull. And along with giving it a megamind look to it, these crests are believed to have anchored the elephant's thick splenius muscles in life, which were designed to help support its giant head. And this was important, not only for moving its giant skull around, but also for wielding its most iconic and hard-to-miss weapons, its tusks. Like many elephants, the Pneumaticus had 2 forward-facing incisor teeth composed of ivory that were elongated and formed into tusks that continued to grow throughout their life. And it's believed that they mostly mirrored those seen in the sister species, the Anticus, who are also known as the straight-tusked elephants, meaning that unlike modern elephants, the Pneumaticus only had a slight curve to their tusks. Additionally, like is the case for other Paleoloxodon species, it's believed that the Pneumaticus's tusks were long even relative to its already massive body, and therefore, it is generally believed to have had the longest tusks of any known animal, period, with the largest of tusks possibly measuring longer than it was tall, at 5 meters or 20 feet, while each also would have weighed more than a freaking jaguar. And yet, thanks to its uniquely designed head and large splenius muscles, it would have had no problem wielding these massive weapons as if they were almost like feathers, allowing them to pierce and maul competition, as well as to absolutely destroy anything dumb enough to get in their way. I mean, imagine this. If a living elephant can already make holes in its own kind with their tusks, just imagine what a Pneumaticus's tusks could do. And when you take a look at modern elephants today, you'll come to realize that their tusks are not the only weapons they have at their disposal, with of course the weight itself also being deadly within its own right. And the Pneumaticus could likely use its body weight to just trample animals directly and deliberately crush them, which, let's just say based on indirect evidence, is very messy and painful. This all said though, these guys weren't all built for damage or defense, as their large skulls also granted them the ability to move their heads down low to the floor, without having to worry about getting off balance, or being unable to lift their heads back up again. And that's a very important feat, as the Pneumaticus is thought to have been a grazing animal. And this is a conclusion that is based off of the morphology of its teeth, as well as the isotope ratios that suggest it predominantly grazed on C4 grasses, instead of being a browser like a giraffe, as one may assume. And considering that some modern-day elephants can spend 16 hours a day on eating alone, and consume up to 70,000 calories, it's not a stretch that based off of the size difference, to assume the Pneumaticus likely spent most of its day eating as well, and needed over 150,000 calories just to sustain its size, which for reference is enough to feed more than 60 people. Yet, as you might be able to imagine, all this time and effort spent on feasting would have left the Pneumaticus a bit more vulnerable to attacks, especially since it likely grazed in open grasslands, putting a big old bullseye on it, relatively and figuratively. But, and perhaps obviously, thanks to its immense size, thick skin, and wicked tusks, fully and even partially grown adults would have been nearly impervious to virtually all predators that lived alongside it, which across its domain included smilodons, other felines like panthers, bears, wolves, hyenas, and even a supersized croc by the name of Ramphosuchus. That is, by the way, actually one of the largest crocodilians to have ever lived. And yet, even with that, I still think an adult Pneumaticus would be well off its menu. Funny enough, or perhaps depressingly depending on your perspective, the only predator that might have actually been a real threat to these guys was a primate. And you only need a mirror to see who I'm talking about. Humans. You see, the Pneumaticus is believed to have evolved sometime during the Middle Pleistocene, a period that began about 700,000 years ago, and it would continue to live into the Late Pleistocene as well. And during these times, modern humans had expanded out of Africa and settled into the rest of the world, with overlap with the Pneumaticus happening along the way, with certain formations we know of yielding not only Pneumaticus bones, but also human bones. And while not set in stone, it is believed that coexistence between our kind and the giant lasted for roughly 30,000 years. And some evidence shows that during this coexistence, we did what we do best, and that is try and kill it. Now, I will say, the evidence in question is actually mostly indirect, as it's comparative evidence involving other Paleoloxodon species, namely the Anticus, Reki, and the Naumani. And these three species were, as I've mentioned before, all exceedingly large, and were also importantly found with clear evidence of having been hunted and butchered by early humans, and modern humans, suggesting that humans were already quite adept at taking down extremely large megafauna. The Naumani in particular is also a very fascinating case, as it is actually the direct descendant of a population of Pneumaticuses that successfully reached Japan via land bridge. But these descendants were already significantly smaller than their ancestors, being only about half the size, and thus it is kind of hard to draw a parallel, as the Pneumaticus may have been exempt from takedown attempts, at least once fully grown. Although, if it was targeted by humans, it has been suggested that projectiles would have been the main weapon of choice. Additionally, even with our quote-unquote expertise in this area, any hunt of this giant would have been an arduous task, as along with its incredible stature, humans would also have to deal with its incredible intelligence. Now, if you didn't know this, it's well established that modern elephants are highly intelligent creatures, and many paleontologists believe that the Pneumaticus was quite intelligent as well, which would have definitely proved useful when defending itself from any threats. And the perceived intelligence of the Pneumaticus would have also played a large role in its social life, with the elephant likely living in complex herds, that would have also added an additional layer of protection to this already well-equipped animal, especially for the juveniles. And so, this intelligence, paired with its other traits and features, made the Paleoloxodon pneumaticus one tough cookie, and a highly successful cookie at that as well. As over the years, fossil remains show that it ended up expanding outside of India, into areas such as Malaysia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Japan of course, and southern China. This being said though, I should mention that some of these international remains, especially the ones in China, have been touted by some paleontologists as really belonging to another species of Paleoloxodon, potentially descendants though. Nevertheless, it's very clear that the largest land mammal ever was no joke, and while it was around, it was one of the most dominant megafauna in the land, if not the planet. Yet, unfortunately, its size seems to have not only been its main advantage, but also disadvantage. Relatively speaking, the Paleoloxodon pneumaticus is a recently extinct animal, with researchers giving it a expiration date between 50,000 and 25,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene. And though it is not guaranteed, some have speculated that it was a cooling trend leading up to the last glacial maximum that caused a change in its habitat, and thus leading to a decrease in the amount of food available. And seeing that, again, this titan needed an extreme amount of calories to sustain itself, its population quickly declined. But as I alluded to, others have also suggested that modern humans might have played a supporting role in its demise as well, citing that while the two did coexist for a long period of time, there was a noticeable change in the population that corresponds quite nicely with the introduction of projectile weapons, which is a little bit suspect. Additionally, other large animals in its environment also became extinct around the same time, including the stegodon, a prehistoric hippo, and a zebra-like horse. Fortunately for us though, unlike most extinct animals, we can still partially appreciate its glory today through its very close relative, the African bush elephant, the current largest terrestrial animal. But what's interesting is that despite the African bush elephant being more similar in size, it's actually the African forest elephant to which it is more closely related to, based off of a mitochondrial DNA analysis, which showed the two are cousins of sorts. And who knows, maybe this cousin will one day give rise to yet another truly giant elephant. Though I can't say I'm keeping my hopes up. Thanks for watching, and until next time, on ExtinctZoo.